Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver.
So today on the show, we're going to be talking about a series of protests that happened this weekend, the No Kings protests. So we'll be talking about kind of what that means, the game theory of it, the broader implications, whether we think this is a good strategy, all sorts of risky business-y takes on the protests, including why I'm scared of crowds. But before we get into all of that, Nate, the Louvre was robbed, and within 7 minutes, a team of robbers was able to get into the second floor window and steal some priceless jewelry. They got in, they got out. By the way, this was 9:30 in the morning. Like, this wasn't late at night. Just completely brazen daytime robbery.
9:30? Why would you? I mean, maybe people aren't expecting it then, right?
Yeah.
I mean, with the French, I mean, they're barely even woke up. They're having their third cup of coffee and their fifth cigarette, right? So they're just getting started.
I think 9:30 a.m. they are still getting started. And yeah, the robbers, they took a truck-mounted ladder and then they gained access to the second floor, which was the Apollo Gallery. And so they were able to get some of the French crown jewels that dated back to Napoleon. And 8 of 9 items remain unaccounted for. They dropped one, which was really weird. They dropped a crown. I was like, wait, how
Did
do
it
you
break?
I don't think so. It's like, how do you drop it? Like, was your tote bag wrong? Like, what? Did something rip? Like, were you using plastic bags? Like, what's going on here?
Are they going to sell these on eBay? Where are they going to sell them?
I have no idea. Oh, apparently, actually, so there's been breaking news, Nate. Breaking, I don't know if it's breaking. They dropped 2 items and not actually 1 item. So they ended up dropping 2 things, not 1. I have no idea. What do you do with crown jewels? I mean, I guess one of the things you can do is take the jewels off, right? Like somehow, like break it apart and from priceless relic make it into just black market jewelry.
It seems like not very economical, right? Like you have to be able to steal jewels that are not crown jewels, and like who would buy? Maybe Trump would buy it.
I don't know, but yeah, the crown of Empress Eugenie is the item that was identified. The other one we don't know. By the way, that piece has 1,354 diamonds and 56 emeralds. That's insane. It was slightly damaged. But it didn't completely break. Okay. Also, like, what the hell, Louvre? Like, their security, like, I think this is the biggest, the museum with the most number of robberies, like, that over in the 20th and 21st century that I know of. I mean, how do you operate security where the Mona Lisa was stolen? Like, that should be the one thing that, like, you're really, really guarding really well. And they've had other break-ins throughout history. I'm like, come on, French people, French security, like, get your shit together. What's going on here?
Look, they just do things in their own way. I admire the French.
I listen, I admire the French. I admire the robbers here. And, I'm so sorry, tourists who, were leaving your tour of the Mona Lisa to the last day. You were planning to go on a Sunday, you were really excited, and then the museum ended up being closed because, some royal jewels were stolen. Talk about risky business. I think that your question, Nate, like, I laughed at it, but like, what in the world are you going to do with it is a really pertinent question because this is a huge risk. Like, what happens? You break into a museum. 7 minutes is ridiculously short to be able to execute something like this. But like, if you get caught, like, seems like those consequences are going to be pretty dire. So you probably need to have a really good plan in place for what you're going to do and how you're going to profit from this heist. And a lot of people don't think that far ahead, and don't realize that a lot of stolen artifacts are really hard to move. Unless maybe they have a buyer already. Like maybe there's like somewhere an Elon Musk type figure. And I mean that in terms of like the amount of money that you have, who is willing to pay, millions and millions of dollars for these specific crown jewels.
But if you buy stolen property, isn't that like some felony or misdemeanor at least?
Well, I don't know the rules in France, but yes, absolutely. And there will definitely be Interpol on the case. And yes, there are safeguards in place against buying them. But I'm assuming that the person who would purchase them would also do it completely, off the grid. Like
on the blockchain, Maria, on the blockchain.
Yes. All right. This heist brought to you by Bitcoin.
By the blockchain.
Yeah, it is a hilarious. I mean, not hilarious, but it is a funny bit of news. And maybe Nate, so we're recording this on Monday, October 20th. Maybe by the time it airs, the thieves will have been caught. And that will be like a huge win for French police. But it took a long time for the Mona Lisa to be recovered when it was stolen. And, some precious works of art, like I'm from Boston. I obviously remember like the Isabella Stewart Gardner museum heist, which was huge. None of those works of art have been recovered. So it can take a really long time from from moment of theft to actually recovering, and that moment of time could be never. So let's see what happens this time. Nate, if you were going to rob a museum, purely hypothetically, what would you steal? Like, is there an item in a museum somewhere that you're like, man, I really just want this at home?
No, because I would get caught. I would go to like a little cafe where they have the jaded barista and take like, whatever, $500. Yeah, I wouldn't want to deprive people of the opportunity to see art. I've always found it like a little bit strange to have like a really valuable piece of art in your private collection. And we collect art, like, but nothing super. Yeah.
I totally agree with that. And I hate, I hate when there are people who buy some like truly beautiful painting and then refuse to loan it out. And like, I understand their insurance considerations, et cetera, but come on, like you had, like, if the Guggenheims could lend out their entire collection, like you can make it work. And, I totally get wanting to live with a beautiful piece of art in your home, but you also like, you can't protect it and take care of it the same way a museum can. And I think that there's definitely a case to be made that sure, you can have it, but like lend it out, let people see it, share the beauty, right? Share the beauty with the world. And by the way, talking about risk, during the Palisade fires earlier this year, some absolutely irreplaceable works of art were destroyed, right? Because you could be a billionaire with a gorgeous Pacific, highway house in Malibu or wherever, and your house goes up in flames, and that's it. Unless you're
the Getty was fine though, right?
Yeah, the Getty was fine. The Getty has an incredibly sophisticated anti-fire protection system, but most normal houses do not. So some works of art were really gone forever now, and that's a risk that you take when you have something like that in your home. Or in the Louvre, I guess the risk you take is that it's going to get stolen at some point. That's so yeah, no, I agree with that. I don't think I wouldn't steal anything either, because I really do think that art is to be shared, right? Art is something that makes us all uniquely human, and it's such a beautiful thing.
If I'm going to do some high risk crimes, I can think of a lot more fun, positive EV high risk crimes, Maria.
Yeah, I totally. Yeah, absolutely. Like what, Nate? Hypothetically speaking, we'll take this off the podcast. We'll do more for our Pushkin Plus subscribers. What would
crime?
So, our would-be criminal spree, Nate, is short-lived because we've decided that we're not going to steal anything from the art museum, but we will retain the optionality of doing something that's going to be lower risk and higher reward. On that note, let's talk about the No Kings protests that happened over the weekend. Nate, did you participate?
No. A, it's not my vibe, although I'm sympathetic to the aims of the protesters. And B, I in certain ways, I do take myself seriously as a journalist. And I think if I went, it would be appropriate to cover them at more arm's length and not to participate. But, we can talk about that or not. Did you, Maria?
I did not, for various reasons, but the biggest one of which is I can't deal with crowds. Like, I hate events where they're... No, I really can't. Like, I get really claustrophobic and really anxious. And
we both live...
I know.
In New York City and Las Vegas, which are maybe, not in the world, but
but there's a very different mentality when you're in a huge crowd of people protesting versus like, on a commute. And just to like give you an example. So, this Saturday, which is when the protests were happening, I went to Grand Central, where I never go. I hate Grand Central, but I went
Wait,
because,
really?
yeah,
Grand Central's nice compared to fucking Penn.
it's beautiful, but I just, I don't like any of the, like, I don't like going to train stations, like, and if I go there, it's for travel, but like Grand Central, I never have to use, like, for whatever reason, I never travel out of Grand Central. Anyway, so I went there specifically to see the Dear New York exhibition from Humans of New York that was closing this weekend. It was 2 weeks during which Grand Central, all of the advertising was taken off, and it was completely taken over by the Humans of New York photography. And they also had a Steinway piano, which was donated, that was in the middle of the hall, and they had Juilliard musicians play during the day and some other cameos. Anyway, so this was a big thing, and I really wanted to see it. And I ended up leaving very quickly because going the day before it closed was not a good idea. And it was so ridiculously crowded. And there were so many people that I couldn't appreciate the photography and the art and all of these things, because not only could I not see anything, but I was being jostled from every single side. And I was like, you know what? It's not, I'm getting out of here. Like, I actually started feeling, this sense of claustrophobia and anxiety. So I don't do well in situations where there are too many people near me. I hate crowded subways, Nate. Whenever I see one that's too crowded and I have to get on, I'm like, oh man, I suddenly envision the worst case scenario, which is that we get stuck, right? That we get stuck in between stations and I'm on this ridiculously crowded subway car. And I have been
Did
stuck.
something happen in childhood, or
I don't know. I have no idea. I just really do not like crowds. It's something that, like, I get very anxious over. So no, I did not go to that protest, and I'm not a protest person. But the underlying question was was there for a reason, which is that, there's, if we think about protests in a broader sense, there's a very strong kind of game theoretic reason why protests are powerful. And that has nothing to do with, like, lots of, you're in a crowd, but everything to do with signaling. I didn't not go because I don't think it's not worth it. I didn't go because just personally, like I said, I hate crowds. But I do think it's worth it for the simple reason that there's coordination issues, and kind of there's power in sending a very strong signal that people can then look at to say, oh, I'm not the only one who feels this way. There are lots of people who feel this way. I know that there is all of this support out there for something that I believe that is not always visible, because when you're online, kind of in, Twitter or whatever it is, you see a very specific subset of opinions. You're in a very specific bubble. But protests throughout history, when people go out in public, it's a signaling mechanism, right? And it's then a coordination mechanism where you can actually point to it and say, okay, look, here's a group of people who hold certain views, and that can be incredibly powerful for future momentum and future decision making, where you realize that something that before you thought, oh, maybe only a few people thought, actually, no, a lot of people think this. By the way, it's even more powerful when we're talking about truly authoritarian regimes, countries where there's very little communication between people. We're not there yet in the United States, but it's powerful even in a democratic society.
These protests had a very large scale. They happened in hundreds of cities. I'm always a little bit skeptical of crowd size estimates, which tend to be overestimates, but several million, I think it's safe to say, which ranks it quite high on the list of, like, all-time one-day protests, at least. I mean, look, as you get a larger size of crowd, then these things tend to become a little bit more amorphous, right? And you can see various critiques like, okay, maybe the protests are a little bit cringe, and considering who we're dealing with, right? We're dealing with, like, kind of like mostly boomery, good government Democrat types. Yeah, they're a little cringe, right? And, like, the message, just when you can critique, I mean, does no kings quite make sense? I'm not sure the idea is Trump is a king so much as a authoritarian. Those aren't quite the same thing exactly, but it kind of doesn't matter, because, like, what you're trying to do is demonstrate that, like, yes, we don't have elections all that often. And yes, last time we had an election, Trump won narrowly. But there are a lot of us, number one. It can serve as a reminder to like the media and things like that. I mean, Trump is not that popular in the polls. He's not popular in the polls. He's not that unpopular either, right? But like, these things can be a spectacle in part and attract attention that is, if anything, like a little bit outsized relative to the number of people participating, right? Because they're physical, they're outside. They're, in some cases, these seem to be rather gentle-minded, but they can be like confrontational, right? If you looked at the number of students and people participating in the pro-Palestinian protests over the past year and a half, those are not particularly large protests. If you look at the numbers for that, it's not like No Kings or something like that, right? However, they still got a ton of media coverage, shifted the narrative. I'm not sure whether they shifted the narrative in the direction the protesters wanted, but they have a big effect potentially.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And I do think that the narrative is also something that's quite important. So I mentioned before kind of the signaling mechanism, which is on an individual level, I think important to then coordinate action further down the line. But also framing the narrative is, especially in the modern age, something that is really important in an attentionally divided economy, right? It's not in the past where everyone watched one single TV show, right? Or one single news channel, and there was kind of this collective knowledge of like, oh, these are the things that are in the news, et cetera, et cetera. These days, it's very fragmented, right? There's a very fragmented media landscape, and so many different things are vying for our attention on any given basis. And the Trump administration has shown itself to be much better than a lot of Democratic operatives, to be perfectly honest, at capturing attention and creating a narrative, right? And creating something that makes it feel like it's this inevitable all-American force. And something like the No Kings protest is a really interesting moment that can potentially shape the narrative of, wait, we have protesters in the heart of red Texas and all of these different areas, and they've all come out and they've all coordinated, and it's a pretty significant number of people. And so I think it's a way of creating a counter narrative to a lot of what we see online. And I think that this might lead us, Nate, to kind of a broader consideration of, what matters, right? When you're trying to kind of craft a narrative that actually changes minds and changes action. Because one of the critiques one can have of things like protest is, well, you're not actually doing anything, right? You're not voting, you're not lobbying, you're not changing legislation, you're not you're not reaching out to your Congress people, like you're not doing anything like that. But on the other hand, you're doing something because you're sending a signal to the government, that these are the things that matter here, where people who feel this way live, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Let me just stop there and get your thoughts on this, and on kind of your thoughts more broadly, kind of about the effectiveness of certain tactics versus other when you're trying to shape a narrative that, with the ultimate goal, because presumably this is the ultimate goal, of change, right? Of actually affecting real change in the government, in government policies, and in what happens in the country going forward.
Yeah, look, I mean, compared to other things, I'd say protesting is relatively effective. I mean, protesting is higher effort than voting. And voting is famously questionably rational, I suppose. If you live in a state like New York, you have your vote in Nevada. But like in general, New York, you're voting kind of as a symbolic act, as a civic act, as a protest almost, and not necessarily as like, I'm going to actually influence the election result, right? Yeah, look, part of it is, look, I don't think the people that kind of talk about like setting the narrative very often are very good about setting the narrative.
Yeah.
Right?
I think that's very true.
And, I've critiqued the Democrats' strategy on the shutdown, right? Because it's like too narrow and like it's not, I don't know, right? And it's like you have to focus on healthcare, right? But their messaging is not about healthcare. If you look at like Google searches for healthcare, people are not particularly focused on that. It's not what they care about healthcare. It's like not what their heart is into. So to have this kind of like amorphous outpouring of peaceful anti-Trump sentiment that's kind of more not normie. I'm sure the people there are watching a lot of MSNBC and reading a lot of Substacks, right? But to have this kind of more normie vibe, I think is worthwhile, right? And it's probably more effective than the shutdown, which again I don't think has accomplished anything for Democrats very much at all. So I do not think, people in blue sky can quote me on this. I do not think that we are on like the doorstep to authoritarianism. I think America has, I think it's an oversimplification, right? I think America has a lot of robust checks and balances which are being substantially frayed. I think we might be in like the anteroom before the doorstep though, right? Yeah. And if there are actions such as like Trump trying to make it difficult for people to vote in 2026 or 2028, for example, right? I mean, you can imagine, open defiance to leave the White House after his term is over, open defiance of a Supreme Court order. One thing that I'll hear from is you'll hear kind of Democratic activists types kind of say like, look, I realize that if you're kind of like leading your life, then things might seem pretty normal unless you're an immigrant or unless there's these other, a student, unless these other certain categories. And like in some sense, Trump has been smart about that. He's been smart about like, yeah, if the world doesn't feel like it's in chaos if you live in New York, right? And I even think that like, there are things like the ICE raids and National Guard deployments in different cities and things like that, right? And if you're very politically aware, these will seem awful, right? But like, but I don't think they're that noticeable for ordinary people either, right? Like I was in Chicago for a talk, the weekend there were a bunch of ICE actions there on the south side of Chicago. And like, I actually had a bunch of like political conversations there. I mean, I have friends there who are interested in politics, and I gave a talk where we talked about politics and stuff like that. And like, it didn't really come up, right? Not because I wasn't thinking about politics or unaware of it, but because like, I think there's this gap between the way that political insiders and political message crafters, people who are very online, experience politics, and the way that ordinary people do. I mean, you're talking about a protest that has mass numbers, millions. You're bridging that gap like a little bit, right? Because, what percent of people watch MSNBC, Fox News, CNN? It's like 1% of the country like watches them on a given day. It's like quite small, you know what I mean?
Is that right? Is that the number?
Yeah, it's really small. And if anything, it probably, political surveys are biased people who participate, right? And so, yeah, like, the number of MSNBC viewers in the demo was in like the low to mid 6 digits, usually, meaning 18 to 49 or however they define that, right? You get a lot of older people who are just kind of watching TV and maybe not doing that much else. But yeah, people kind of miss these scale things. And the number one problem that like most political strategists have is like, they think exactly the opposite from how the normies do. A more narrow protest, right? Like, I would take, again, the Gaza protests as something that have like relatively clear goals, right? And they spin out into things and there's messaging that might be dumb and whatever else, right? But like, on a university, we want the university to divest these investments and change this policy and this and that, right? And those are pretty narrowly targeted protests, but smaller in scale. This is amorphous. I mean, things like Occupy Wall Street, which was not particularly large protest, right? But like, or the Tea Party is an example on the Republican conservative side, a little bit more, right? Those are a little bit amorphous. And amorphousness can be good because like you want different people to be able to interpret it in different ways. And, the overall sentiment is clear enough. Trump bad, but worried about authoritarian rule or monarchical rule. I'll give them a pass on the imprecise metaphor.
What do you think is more effective, having a protest that has very clear stated goals or ones that are expressing these broader sentiments. Because I don't know what your perception of Occupy Wall Street's ultimate effectiveness was. Mine was that not much ended up changing. It was also Occupy Wall Street, by the way, was on a much smaller scale than what we're talking about with No Kings. But what's your sense of like, if you were organized, if you were trying to be like, okay, I want people to be aware of all of these. I want to draw attention to all of these excesses happening that people might not be aware of unless they're very like politically tied in. I want them to be aware of, tipping points in kind of the legal structure, et cetera, that some of these checks are, yes, so far democracy is holding. We do have robust checks and balances, but we are in the ante room, as you said, as you phrased it. And like some of these things are really being strained, and a lot of people don't seem to be aware of that. Like, if you were organizing a protest, would it look like the No Kings protest? Broadly speaking, like, let's, as you say, let's ignore the semantics. Like, would it be kind of more amorphous, like general sentiment, like, please work with us legislators, and like, let's try to figure out a strategy to counter this? Or would you say, what, before we do this protest, like, let's think of 3 big goals and like have everyone have posters with those, with those goals, et cetera, and like actually try to do something that is more targeted, but still broad. I don't know that I have a clear answer to that. So I'm curious whether you do.
Yeah, look, I don't know if I'm the expert on protests here. By the way, I think Occupy Wall Street punched somewhat above its weight. Like, it kind of introduced or at least popularized the phrase "we are the 99% and the 1%."
That's true.
Like,
that's actually true. That's
a meme that transmits
point
for many years, 14 years later, whatever it is, is pretty powerful potentially.
It's so funny. I totally forgot that came from Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, you're right.
I think you have different issues here. One is that although Trump is unpopular, he's not enormously unpopular. He won election twice, including just, not quite a year ago. And the critiques of him are kind of disparate, right? People don't like, some people are concerned about the economy, which I think might be a more appropriate subject for focus, in part because it is noticeable day to day a little bit more. People are concerned about immigration or authoritarianism. There are longstanding concerns about climate change and whatever else. People think he's racist, xenophobic, sexist. People think he's corrupt. I'm not unendorsing any of these ideas, by the way, right? But like, Trump has always given people such a large attack surface, the term is, different ways in, that like, it actually kind of renders itself sort of ineffective, right? And so like, on the one hand, it might seem like the way to attack that is to focus on one particular avenue, right? However, A, is that the right avenue? And B, like, I think counterintuitively that might work less well, right? Because like, number one, again, all the total anti-Trump Democratic energy, they're trying to make the shutdown about healthcare. If you read the newsletters, read the Substacks, liberal Substacks, or Blue Sky, whatever else, right? Maybe 1 or 2% of the messages are about healthcare from like, not the actual base, but like the activist online part of the base, right? And so like, you're kind of losing people there a little bit. Number two, Trump is very, very good at like changing the subject or redirecting attention, right? So if he ever has a weakness, he's like, so the metaphor of like Trump being the ship that you have different conduits to attack, right? Like, it doesn't quite work because it can fight back in different ways, right? So, maybe having this kind of like more amorphous kind of gathering of energy, what I don't know of, having not been to the protest, right? The most important thing is probably, are you gathering lists of people who can become politically organized in different ways? And importantly for me, can you have these lists that are outside the auspices of the kind of capital D Democratic Party, right? I think the Democratic Party is often healthy at like the local and state level, but like, I too, first approximation, think that like every person in a position of power in the Democratic Party should be fired, right? Like, I think the party has lost. No, I mean, seriously, like, the Democratic Party has like lost like it lost an election to Trump twice, right? It just thought renominating Joe Biden was a good idea. All the leaders are too fucking old. Like anybody over the age of 50 in a leadership position, let's have a generational divide, right? Anybody over the age of 50 in the Democratic Party, I think Democrats' goals would be better off if those people were, replaced. If you want to take a couple mulligans for people who are exceptional, right? But so to have I'm not so sure that it's so far from what I'd endorse. Again, the vibe is not mine. It feels a little cringe to me, but cringe is okay. Happens when you have mass support for something, right? It's inherently a little cringe. If you go to a NFL game, the NFL is the most popular sport. NFL games are a little bit cringe. I love football, right? They're a little bit cringe. Parades are fucking cringe as fuck, right? Holidays are cringe. I mean, all these things that are really popular are people still watch American Idol. American Idol is cringe. Popular things are cringe, Maria.
Oh man, don't get me started on parades. I used to live right next to the Halloween parade route in the West Village.
You're not a real New Yorker until you've had a dinner reservation canceled.
That's what happened. So I had lived in the West Village for my whole all of my New York existence. That's where I moved when I just moved from Boston, and just loved the area and stayed there. And so every single year I saw, the havoc that happened with the Halloween parade, and knew that basically on Halloween I had to just stay in my apartment and don't do anything that crosses 7th Avenue. And then one day I saw there was a restaurant I had really wanted to go to, and finally saw a reservation pop up, and I was like, yay, and took it. And of course the reservation popped up because it was on the other side of 7th Avenue. And
it's like the Berlin Wall for a day. It really, if you haven't experienced, it's very hard to you have to go up to a roof tower and find ways to escape, and
Yeah, exactly. It's horrifying. But, it's interesting to talk about this and to talk about the importance of general vibes, because if you and I, when you and I talked about the best way to organize a little less than a year ago, Nate. And we were talking about, what can Democrats do? We decided collectively that they needed to focus on a few issues. And when we were talking about how do they win, right before Trump got elected, we were saying, okay, your messaging should be focused on a few issues where you can actually get votes, where people are passionate about this, because the Trump campaign was much more effective at that. And we were saying, I remember you talking about immigration and saying, hey, Democrats, immigration's not your issue. Stop talking about that. Instead, let's try to focus on things that healthcare, right? That could actually be much more effective. Then we were talking, with the shutdown, et cetera, that we should really be focusing on let's focus on tariffs. Let's do something focused when we're talking about inside the government. And yet our advice for people kind of outside the government seems to be to have more of that vibe type of approach, where you have, as you say, cringe, but we don't have to call them cringe, but when you have these large scale events that just show a general state of malaise, displeasure, and opens the conversation up for policymakers to kind of act in different ways, as opposed to pinpointing one specific thing.
Yeah, no, that's the other thing, is if you're a political operative, then ironically you have often a very short-term time horizon, right?
Yep.
You have a job where you get up and go to the office at 8:30 every Monday. Maybe it's a romanticization of it, right? But you have particular goals you have for that day,
Yep.
that week, that news cycle, right? And the media is the same way. Some weeks, Maria, we have 8 things we'd love to talk about, right? Some weeks it's a little struggle, right? But you kind of even that out, and some things become talking points. And so it should be more long-term focused, right? We still have more than a year until the midterm elections. Even we have more than 3 years until the presidential election. And so, look, the Democratic Party has always been that historically they're kind of this collection of different interest groups, right? That Democrats were a collection of young people and union workers and people of color and college professors and gay people and other people who are, ex-communists and like a whole motley crew of different types of folks that like don't necessarily have that much interest in common, but might be marginalized in some ways, plus some kind of like pointy-headed intellectuals, right? What the Democratic Party is now is a little bit less clear, right? It's lost some support from every one of those groups except the pointy-headed intellectuals, basically, right? It's lost substantial support among Hispanic and Asian Americans. It's lost some support among Black Democrats. It's lost a lot of support among like working class union worker type of Democrats, right? It's lost some support about young people, particularly young men, right? So, you still don't have a lot of people who have their pet quote unquote issues, whether it's the environment or LGBTQ plus rights or healthcare or economics or authority, right? And like whenever you say, oh, let's focus on this one issue, well, the other groups feel really upset, right? And they'll say, my issue is a matter of existential importance. There's what's called special pleading, right? It's like very hard to like have to kind of, who gets to pick and choose what issues we prioritize. And so like to have stuff be amorphous, I had an anthropology professor was like, ambiguity is okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was like, the more ambiguous you are on your paper, the better. I'm like, that seems kind of weird, right? But I was pretty good at optimizing for ambiguity.
I'm not surprised, Nate. I'm not surprised. But no, I actually think that you just made a really important point, which is that having a protest that's like the No Kings protest unites people, right? As opposed to having people feel like they're left out, like this is not my protest. This is everyone's protest. This is like uniting on the absolute highest level issue. We believe in our democracy and we want to preserve it. So if you think about kind of the psychology of in-groups and out-groups, right? We are very good at forming in-groups and out-groups based on anything, right? Almost immediately. But we're also very good at unifying when you can actually kind of get a bigger issue that focuses on commonalities as opposed to divisions. And so I think that something like a No Kings protest did a really good job of actually tapping into that element of psychology, right? Of on a high level, like, let's put our differences aside, right? Let's put aside whether like who we are and what to us is the existential issue and how we feel about, all of these different people and all of these different policies. And instead, let's focus on one thing. Like, we believe in America. We believe in democracy. We want to preserve this thing that the country was founded on. And I think that's why the No Kings, like, even though not quite right, while symbolically it actually helps kind of get to that unification. It helps to harken back to a moment in history when America was united, right? Where it didn't matter what political party you were. Nothing mattered other than that we were fighting against the British and we wanted to be free.
Yeah, look, I mean, this is a problem that you have in very online communities, maybe more the left than the right. Currently, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, but like the notion of online combat on Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, whatever, etc., right? The notion of dunking on people, achieving kind of social superiority, right? It's often people competing for a hierarchy, to tear down a hierarchy, to regain footing in the hierarchy themselves, right? And by definition, it's kind of exclusionary, right?
Yeah.
Republicans do lots of that too. They are fortunate enough to have this kind of, and again, I'm not a super lib, right? I'm going to say this in a way that I believe is like a correct arm's length critique, but like there is a substantial like personality cult around Trump that helps keep Republicans united with all types of long-term consequences and consequences to the country, right? But like Democrats have no equivalent of, right? So they're both exclusionary, at least if you look kind of like the Blue Sky types, and leaderless. And that's a really bad combination. You know what I mean? It's like, we don't have a clear idea, but we don't want you participating unless you agree with us on all these issues, right? So the breadth and inclusivity is very important.
Yeah, I think that that's a key issue that Democrats have been ignoring for too long and that they really, really need to focus on, which is that it's okay, right? Shades of gray are okay. And we want to include you, even if you don't check all of these boxes for kind of what the perfect liberal mind thinks on all of these issues, what's in vogue on all of these things. I think that the Republicans have actually been much, much better at including people in the party and saying, fine, like you don't believe in that, but like at least you believe in Trump, you believe in this, like come on in. And I do think that the Democratic establishment has actually been very quick to, I don't want to say like cancel, but to cancel their own, right? To say, well, like, sure, you're a Democrat, but you said something I don't like about this issue.
Or to
and
dismiss whole groups of voters. Hillary Clinton made the infamous like deplorables comment in 2016, I guess it was, which is saying like, half of, not all voters, half of Trump voters are irredeemable, racist, misogynist, etc., and half are redeemable and a little bit misguided, right? Which I think is actually probably might be about right as a kind of empirical statement, right? As a piece of political analysis.
But as a politician,
yeah, you don't... and the fact is that like you never know where you find like this is a big kind of people mistake like the group tendency with the marginal tendency, right?
Sure.
In any group, and I've tried to mathematically model this and but I won't get into the details now. In any group, there are always marginal voters, right? The fact that Trump would like go to the Bronx and say, I'm going to do a rally among the black community in the South Bronx. And if you look at the details, and a lot of people are not black and or not from the South Bronx or the Bronx at all, right? But like the fact that he's saying, I would like to have your vote, right? Like, I don't think Democrats do the same thing, right? They don't go and say to an evangelical white church and say, you know what? Here's rationales why you might want to vote for Democrats, right? Maybe they kind of implicitly do it, and like people who are on the center left are regarded as enemies by the far left, and often vice versa. And so like it's getting out of that mentality is essential.
It's absolutely crucial, and I think the No Kings protest is a really good step in that direction. If we can keep that kind of thinking, right? Like, how do we unite all the people who came to the protests, and how do we actually keep them in the fold and keep them unified and realize that like when you have existential threats, like let's stop nitpicking about like all sorts of tiny things that may in the grand scheme of things not be that important. Plus, like, let's go back full circle to what we were discussing at the beginning, which is protests as a coordination mechanism. I think that with the pendulum kind of swinging back against like some of the very PC wokeness types of things that were happening in over the last 5 to 10 years, all of a sudden, all of these voices who felt like they couldn't say anything were speaking out, and it turned out, oh, hey, not a lot of liberals didn't agree with a lot of these cancellations and with a lot of what was going on college campuses and, professors losing their jobs for certain things. People thought that this was bad, but no one spoke out at the time, right? Because they thought that speaking out would kind of get them canceled too, and they were probably right. And so it's one of these things where like people don't speak out because they think that no one else feels that way. They think they're a minority. They feel like they're going to be piled on. And so once again, the importance of coordination mechanisms in saying, okay, it's okay to speak out against certain things and to voice certain beliefs is kind of bringing it full circle is one of the functions that we need to be thinking about, that we need to accomplish.
Yeah, and these protests probably should. We haven't mentioned this context. The last really major set of liberal coded protests were the George Floyd protests, which I think Democrats feel ambivalently about now, right? Because there were pockets of it that were violent, and B, some of the rhetoric was stuff that like they've tried to distance themselves from today. So I just want to give that piece of, we're analyzing recent U.S. political protests. I don't want to ignore that for our listeners.
The main kind of takeaways here are like coordination is important and signaling is important and kind of understanding all of that from a game theory standpoint is important, but also inclusivity is important and trying to frame things in broad terms where you can actually unite people and focus on uniting as opposed to dividing and nitpicking and like, saying, oh, well, you belong, but you really don't. You're not our perfect archetype of who we want. That it's really important to think in those types of terms. And the third thing that we haven't talked about as much, but we have mentioned, is that you do need to have the long term in mind, right? That it's so easy to be focused on kind of the immediate term on, oh, like, I don't want someone to be mad at me right now. I don't want to get canceled right now. I don't want these negative repercussions right now. And you don't think, well, like, if I don't speak out now, then there might be nothing to speak out. Nothing left to speak out for in a few years. Like, people just don't think long term. Like, if I don't do something right now, the Democratic Party is just going to implode. Like, if I don't do this, then these are the long-term consequences. So I think that thinking more long-term and long-term strategy is very important. I don't necessarily endorse, Nate, axing everyone over 50. 50 seems awfully young, but still, I think that the spirit of that we do need kind of a little bit, we do need some young blood, is fair, because we do need to be thinking about the future, and people who are 80 years old are not the future because they're going to be dead in the long term that we're talking about, absent the singularity.
And with that, maybe we can retreat from the ante room to the foyer before the ante room before the doorway to authoritarianism.